Upon taking office in 2019, Governor Gretchen Whitmer enacted Executive Order 2019-09. The purpose of that particular executive order was to expand the existing Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, which is from 1976. That particular act prohibits discrimination in employment and providing housing, education, and public accommodations based on race, religion, national origin, age, weight, height, marital status, and disability. Before this particular order was signed, prohibitions already existed in Michigan against discrimination from employers. That included sexual orientation and gender identity. However, what this act did was it expanded its reach. It said if you're an employer or a business owner who receives a grant, a loan, or a contract from the state of Michigan, state agencies are not allowed to contract with you if you discriminate against your employees who are members of a protected class. So if you're looking at the statute on this, it's going to fall under Michigan Compiled Laws, Section 37.2101 to Michigan Compiled Laws, Section 37.2804. The questions that this particular study is going to address include finding out whether or not, since its implementation, Executive Order 2019-09 has been successful at reducing the number of discrimination claims filed against the state of Michigan. And second, we're going to ask the question, how does the state's DEI program compare to other states with similar programs? Why is this act important? Until recent, the LGBTQ community in Michigan had very little support. A lot of their support came from different groups that were supporting them rather than being activists. So this was a very small scale. And one of the reasons for this is because we had something come about in the early 2000s known as the Marriage Protection Amendment. A lot of people ended up referring to that as the Defense of Marriage Act. And that particular act basically said that the state of Michigan will not recognize marriage outside of the union between a husband and wife. That also caused a lot of issues with domestic partnerships because you had people that normally were able to get their significant other benefits through the state of Michigan. They were no longer able to do so because of same-sex relationships. I have a lot of friends in that position, and when they call to get benefits now, you can get them, but they're still at a significantly higher rate than it would be if you were a married couple. Between 2004 and 2018, there were several attempts made to expand the Elliott Larson Act, including Rick Snyder. He was our former governor's executive directive 2018-08. That particular directive recognized sexual orientation as a protected class, but these protections were only applicable to state employees. It's also important because of federal funding. Right now, we have a lot of colleges and universities within the state that have decided, even though they've spent millions of dollars in research and in putting together DEI programs, that they would rather go ahead and disband and follow President Trump's order instead of deciding, hey, we're going to fight this particular action. So that's one thing that's going on right now that is causing a lot of states to reconsider the DEI programs or to go ahead and disband those. University of Michigan was one of these locations who decided to actually disband. And when they did, what happened was their employees who worked for the DEI department ended up going to various other departments. One of the problems that we're hearing a lot from people who are part of these DEI organizations is the fact that they think that what we're really doing is not making a more inclusive environment by breaking apart the program, but instead causing it to be more exclusive because students won't have a means to go forward and actually get the support that they need in order to finish their college degree. When we look at previous research studies, one of the things that we see is that 4% of the American workforce identified as LGBTQ, and out of that 4%, 184,000 of these were employees that live in the state of Michigan. In the mid 2000s, in like around 2010, 2008 maybe, um, there were interviews and surveys conducted of state employees who reported that they feel more discrimination on the job and tend to have more job loss experienced because of sexual orientation and gender identity than those who fall under other classifications. Previously, I mentioned the federal DEI stance. What we need to understand is this is something that's new. When I did my research, I had to use more than just scholarly journals because of the newness involved. So, January 20th, Donald Trump issued an executive order ending what he referred to as radical and wasteful government DEI programs. So, essentially, what this did is it repealed President Biden's executive order on DEI programs. And President Trump referred to that as advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Since this time, like I mentioned before, University of Michigan and some other schools have decided to disband their programs. Um, while President Trump has asked that others sign anti-DEI policies, just agreeing that in order to move forward and get federal funding, they're going to comply with President Trump's order. When we talk about the policy goals of this particular executive order, we have to understand that what Governor Whitmer was trying to do is create a roadmap, create some sort of a model that other businesses need to go by um, in order to ensure fairness and equity or equality for Michigan residents and citizens. So, what this really means is she wanted to put a plan in place where we can have some sort of accountability. Not only is discrimination not going to be tolerated in state government when we do hiring practices or things of that nature, but she also wanted this to apply to businesses to sort of have some sort of control over those businesses. There is a major drawback, though. Generally, when we have an executive order or an executive directive, it only applies to the executive branch of state government. So, what that means is we're not really saying, hey, private business, we're going to control you. The only thing that the governor's office or that the state of Michigan can control is who receives funding. So grants, loans, things of that nature. All right, we're going to get into the specifics of the program. First of all, in order to ensure that we have some sort of enforcement of the new rules and regulations, the governor actually appointed what she refers to as equity and inclusion officers or EIOs. And what those people do is they just make sure that everything's enforced. And they also provide reports to the governor on a regular basis about what DEI standards and practices are currently going on within their departments. In total, every Michigan department has an EIO, and there are 28 in total currently. When we look at the stakeholders of this policy, I'd just like to mention that those include employees who are classified, unclassified, contractors, residents, and those, of course, that receive grants, loans, or contracts with the state. All right, when we look at the evaluation design here, we're looking at this from a qualitative perspective. Yes, there were some statistics that I was able to find, but mostly this is going to be qualitative. So the design is going to actually allow me to assess whether the DEI policy is effective in comparison to what other states are doing. My research indicates that there are at least 4 other states who have similar policies to Michigan, and I wanted to take a look at those to see whether or not, in comparison, we're actually doing a good job. Another thing that we're going to examine is we're going to take a look at some of these states as well as other states and figure out whether or not um, their DEI programs are actually going to survive the federal government's directive. One of the things that we need to know is that when federal or state laws change, so do DEI policies. Our desired outcome is that discrimination numbers in the state of Michigan will be reduced from what they were prior to the creation of this executive order. So what we're looking at here is basically what the EEOC would refer to as charges against the state or a state agency. So what resources are needed for this particular order? First of all, diversity training for every department. That training should focus on discrimination and providing services because this also applies to state agencies that provide services to individuals, for example, DHHS. We also need to identify what the protected classes are and provide scenarios to employees on what amounts to discrimination because sometimes there's a gray area. Or it may be a situation where the employee doesn't understand that what they're doing is technically discrimination. Another thing that we should probably do is before we award contracts to businesses or provide them with grants or loans, we should ask for them to provide demographic information on their employees to us. Now that's difficult because a private business, we don't really have a lot of purview. So I think if this particular um, policy fails, that's going to be the failing point is how do we actually, make sure that these businesses comply. I don't know, when we talk about internal hiring, we need to provide diversity training for our employees as well as hiring managers to ensure that they don't violate the executive order. And training should focus on discrimination in providing services as well as identify the protected classes and just in, hopefully look towards that demographic information being provided. Data collection for this particular study is unique. We're going to be looking at case law, federal civil rights law, because that's technically what DEI programs follow. They don't want to violate federal law, essentially. So when we talk about federal law, we're actually referring to the Civil Rights Act. And what we're going to do is find out whether or not Michigan's statute is actually compliant. And we're going to also take a look at the discrimination filings before 2019 as well as those after to see if the numbers have gone down. That's a very good measure for us to use to figure out whether or not we're actually doing something good. We're also going to look at the DEI policy information for the states that I mentioned before, which would be Colorado, New York, Pennsylvania. The data sources. So here's what we need to understand is when we look at whether or not a program's successful, every state has their own list of things that they want to check or that they naturally look into. So first of all, I've mentioned that EIOs have been um, appointed to ensure compliance. We also have a development of a DEI dashboard and report that was being done at University of Michigan. They developed metrics and track the progress of the outcomes. There's also DEI scorecards. So Michigan State University, for example, it has used scorecards in order to assess the progress of these DEI goals. We also have a location called Data USA. That's a company that provides demographics about residents in the state to kind of help us measure whether or not we're doing okay. All right, I've mentioned the use of universities in these metrics. So one of the things that we need to know here is that Michigan State University also tracks student outcomes, such as retention and probation. And any demographic information that's needed is generally provided by Data USA. Another item that's used to determine successfulness would be the employee engagement surveys. And just so you know, the Office of General Management also oversees DEI efforts across state government. When we look at specifics, just know that organizations track employee demographics, representation, and leadership positions. So, how diverse are our leaders? In my area in particular, I'm one of 14 managers, and I'm the only female 14. So that's something to know, but it's also unique because it's IT. And they also track the training participation. The state of Michigan has a lot of trainings that are open to employees. Some are required, but some are open. And these DEI training programs are generally open. They may require us to do one per year, but anything in addition to that is open. Departments are regularly required to review their policies and procedures and ensure that they are considered inclusive. And we also have consultants that meet with the state and different agencies on a regular basis to let us know what their recommendations are for our DEI program. And then finally, training and education. Training and education is generally provided by the different departments. As I mentioned before, we have case law. We're also going to locate some statutes, Michigan compiled laws, for example, using Google Scholar. We're going to use EKU libraries and just basic Google search as well. And like I mentioned before, this is fairly new, the DEI programs, as well as what's going on in the media currently. So you may actually see blog posts as well as electronic newspaper articles in this particular study. And I was able to locate some statistics on charges brought before the EEOC prior to 2019 and after. One of the things that I've mentioned before is this is a new thing, DEI programs, but we need to also understand that newer data isn't available. You would think that it is, but the closest that I could get to present day was 2022. All right, test question. Is Michigan's DEI policy effective when compared to those of other states? My hypothesis is yes, Michigan's DEI policy is effective when compared to those of other states. All right, so there are general ways that we test for effectiveness. First of all, you can do that through qualitative and quantitative metrics. And these might include demographic data, information on hiring, promotions, employee experience. A lot of times that comes to us through a survey. And we can also look at retention and attrition rates, equitable pay information, inclusion data, and information on customer experience. Like I mentioned before, a lot of this comes from survey data. And one of the things that came out of this is whenever we look at prior to 2019 versus after in terms of charges, um, that is a way that we come up with measures to determine whether or not the program is effective. Um, so one example would be whether the number of discrimination complaints or what we call charges have dropped since implementation of the policy. And this is going to be something that I'm going to review in the data and analysis section of the study. I will let you know that generally speaking, I do have a chart that kind of takes a look at what the numbers are in terms of discrimination charges before and after 2019. All right. Based on the EEOC information on the charges brought against the state of Michigan for discrimination of a protected class, um, I have listed here, even though the fiscal year goes from 2009 to 2022, I've listed the last couple of years. So 2018, the total number of charges brought against the state or a state agency were 2,473 versus 1819 in fiscal year 2022. So what that is that's a good indication that our numbers are actually going down. There's less charges for discrimination brought against the state of Michigan, which really, if you think about it, that's a good indication that, hey, what we're doing is working. This particular executive order served a purpose and it's doing well. Now, there were some points of interest that I wanted to throw out here, some interesting details. First of all, even though the overall numbers have gone down, when I looked at the overall trend between 2009 to 2022, retaliation as well as charges for unequal pay um, are things that seem to be either leveling on the same level as they were before, or they're actually starting to increase. So, retaliatory practices, in case you're unfamiliar with that, that's when you file a discrimination case or a charge, and your employer gets that information and they decide to do something in retaliation. Maybe that's firing, maybe that's wrongful termination. Um, just for example, but that's where those cases come from. When you look at religion, it looks like those numbers are up pretty far from what they were in 2018. Um, I've just added a few extra items on here just in case. It looks like disability discrimination has gone down from 2018 from a number of 846 down to 571. Now we're going to get into our comparisons. The first state that I wanted to mention is Colorado. Colorado has a very similar program to what we have in Michigan. That comes from Executive Order 2020-175. It's a policy that prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, color, national origin, disability, age, low income, limited English proficiency, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and marital expression. So here, instead of an EIO like we have in Michigan, we have what they call a chief compliance officer. And they're basically the coordinator for the department's federal Title 11. So they're responsible for making sure that the policies and procedures are complied with throughout all departments in the state of Colorado. And I do kind of mention here some information that I found out about Trump's executive order. When asked to sign the document for anti-DEI, Colorado said, no, we're not going to do that because our K through 12 programs, as well as colleges and universities and state agencies, um, they really do need diversity and inclusion in our state. So we're not going to sign this. So I just found that kind of interesting. I've kind of mentioned this before, but when we measure effectiveness, it's different for every state because they have their own standards and practices. So if we take a look at Colorado and we're looking at program effectiveness, they actually look at employee engagement scores the same as Michigan does. They also look at recruitment and retention data and pay equality. So pay equality is something that the state of Michigan doesn't really dive into a whole lot, but there is actually a statute out there in Colorado called the Pay Transparency Statute, which provides information that the employee has a right to disclose their pay information, um, and to have that be public knowledge. They also look at leadership demographics just like Michigan does. Something that they do that's different is they look at budget efficiency. And they also take a look at the impact of diversity training, which is something Michigan does as well. And employee resource groups are tracked. So that's something that actually came about through their DEI policy, is the actual creation of these diversity groups. They also have annual reports that are provided to executive directors from each department, and these are actually given to the governor as well as the Department of Personnel Administration. They just provide information on what the DEI efforts are currently. There will be additional information coming in the next few days because I'm still working through the details of this project. But we're also going to, of course, take a look at a couple of other states and see if they're doing things any differently. I've been trying to locate metrics. Metrics are very difficult for DEI. The only thing I've mentioned before is the EEOC information is out there. So thank you. The end.